I'll just build up to this in a slightly roundabout way. There are really three reasons, three ways that we're hoping to sort of get them, so to speak, for 9/11. One is the foreign media and the internet, and that's doing quite well. I mean, the internet's always done well for us, and the foreign media increasingly are beginning to sort of crumble and go with general world opinion, which is that 9/11 quite likely was an inside job. So that's going quite well as well. And of course, here in Britain, we're going to be the last to see that because, London and Washington, as discussed here, are absolutely, like they're inseparable, not to mention Tel Aviv. So we're not noticing that much, but I promise you it is happening. And then you've got the second line of attack has been the forensic issues, with Richard Gate's brilliant sort of campaign to bring artists and engineers on for 9/11 Truth. And I think the important thing there is that your average architect, I mean, I can't prove this, but we had some work done on our house and an engineer came in and he wasn't chosen for any other reason that he was going to do some work on our house. He was actually very sceptical about 9/11. Somehow this guy in Hove had discovered, just a typical guy, so far as I could see, had discovered that, this is a very suspect story. We're getting the same sort of reports from the Royal Institute of British Architects. So that's all going pretty well. However, there is a problem with forensic issues, which Michael Rupert, who was an early researcher into 9/11, put his finger on. He was an ex-policeman, and he basically said, with forensic issues, you can always find an expert who is going to say whatever you pay them to say, especially if they're getting lots of research grants from you, and we're seeing that with Purdue University, seem to be prepared to provide limitless, apparent computerized, justifications of why the official story at the Pentagon's true, why the towers collapsed. So that is the problem with forensic issues. You can always get, especially if you're the government and paying so much money, so much control of the economy now, you can always get somebody to say anything you want, and that's always going to be a problem with the forensic issues. And then you've got the paper trail. Now, at first sight, the paper trail looks like pretty hopeless. You've got to do a lot of reading. The average, Inspector General's report in the United States probably comes out at about, 150 pages. And there's lots of it now. Secondly, it takes a bit of explaining. It doesn't have pictures. It's just all about statements and affidavits and things like that, and investigations and what was this in this email. So, you can, with the sort of short-term attention span that we all have nowadays, I accept myself, so you all have nowadays, just a joke, it doesn't really do very well on the internet, the paper trail. Although actually, in a sense, it's benefiting from the internet because we can now all read these released documents without having to actually literally travel to Washington and go to the particular library to look at them. Anyway, the paper trail really started with the first FBI officers who complained that they'd tried to investigate 9/11 and they'd been stopped by their superiors. And that was actually a very big story. Colleen Rowley was made Woman of the Year, but the story became incompetence, predictably. Incompetence, lost emails, too busy with other things. But actually, it was about 3 different FBI officers who were all saying the same thing, So then the story became, that just means a lot of incompetence. And it was all actually on the desk of the same guy in FBI headquarters. All these things got lost, and he had to say how he'd forgotten to read this email and didn't realise the significance of this report. And this was, of course, connected mainly with the case of Zacharias Moussaoui, who was alleged to be the 20th hijacker, who had been arrested. And very likely was, he wanted to fly planes, he didn't want to land them. And of course that brings us on to just one other problem with the paper trail. People who think that the whole 9/11 story is utterly, utterly false from beginning to end, it was drone planes, or maybe there weren't even any planes, or all those sort of lines of attack. They don't like to hear about the paper trail, because the paper trail actually indicates much more what you could call the ringleader and patsy explanation. In other words, they did produce a few Islamic radicals who would have liked to have carried out 9/11, but they helped them. They needed help because they actually could never have done it themselves. They couldn't fly planes, they couldn't operate in America without getting caught, as in the case of Zacharias Moussaoui, who did get caught. Why would they, the issue is really, do you think that they can, would you rather, if you were in the CIA organising all this, let's say for the sake of argument it was the CIA organising, I think it probably was, would you rather have a completely fake event with fake passengers, fake planes? Surely, in the modern world, that's a bit of a risk. What happens if the Russians manage to take some pictures of your fake planes and show that they're actually cruise missiles or whatever? So I've personally always thought that, the complete fakery explanation probably isn't the way to go, although you can't rule anything out. But those guys, they hate paper trail researchers such as me, because they say that we're sort of substantiating, libel against Muslims. I mean, the fact is that there are quite a lot of angry radical Muslims who would have liked to have carried out 9/11, and I personally think it's, I'm sorry if I'm insulting anybody's opinion here, I personally think it's stupid to say that that isn't the case. So anyway, we had our FBI offices, 3 of them. So at that point, I was writing my first book, and I went off to a friend of mine who I'll call G, who I knew at Oxford, and he now works, he has worked in sort of serious crime investigations, sort of major international criminal networks. And I said to him, hey G, I said, he totally believes the official story of 9/11, this guy, which is very useful, so it's best not to have arguments necessarily with people and get their back up. I've never really argued with him about it because he's so dyed-in-the-wool type. And I said, hey, well, how do you explain these FBI officers? Easy, he said. That's always what happens when there's another squad that's chasing somebody. So, if you're chasing a gang of drug smugglers, the last thing you want is for them to get accidentally arrested by some other coppers who might only catch them with 1 kilo of cannabis when you're just planning to catch them with 50 tons of cannabis. So, that is always what happens. If there's a major investigation on, a little flag gets put on people's computer records. And the famous Oxford and English drug smuggler, Howard Marks, classically benefited from this. And if you ever do want to sort of get away with petty crime, just set yourself up as a major crime figure and you will get a free pass. You'll get a free pass through borders, you'll get a free pass if you ever are arrested, because a little thing comes up saying, keep your hands off him. So this is what obviously was happening with these FBI officers. But there's a big problem, because where was this other investigation that was used as a justification for closing down the FBI investigations, especially when you consider the FBI was legally responsible for all investigations within the US, and indeed President Clinton put the FBI in charge of all global, that's been forgotten now, all global anti-terrorism actions. So they were even active in Yemen when the USS Cole was bombed allegedly by Al-Qaeda. So, where was this? Who was it who took the FBI off the case illegally, as far as we can see? Maybe there was a secret. I mean, the president could have done it. Cheney could have done it. They could have issued directives saying, take the FBI off the case. And once again, we end up with the finger pointing at Cheney and the president. You can't have a guy in the FBI deciding that, or a guy in the CIA. It has to go to the president, as far as I understand. So, where was this investigation? Obviously, they didn't stop the 9/11 attacks happening, because they happened. And funnily enough, actually, the alleged hijackers all bought their tickets in advance. So, whoever told the FBI not to get on the case, because they've got a better case, they didn't even notice that we have to believe that they didn't even notice that all these hijackers were all buying their tickets for the 11th of September, morning of the 11th of September, all on planes, from different places, all flying at the same time. So, and that's just not credible. At the very least, you need to know why that is. And frankly, for most people in the world by now, if they really think about that, it's bloody obvious, that this plot was protected. And then, of course, you get to the question of how the guys could have flown the planes. And, it's not easy to fly planes like that. And most of us think that somehow there must have been some sort of remote control element in it, because otherwise they wouldn't have succeeded. So that's how far we got at the time I wrote my book. Well, of course, nobody listens to me, especially not in the mainstream media. But interestingly, the evidence was there of how the CIA had the Osama bin Laden unit of the CIA, which was never announced. I mean, at the time of 9/11, they all went on TV, oh, we lost interest in Afghanistan, this is a blowback, what a pity we let Afghanistan rot after we kicked the Russians out. Osama bin Laden, well, we knew a little bit about him, we never imagined, but now we've just realised that Al-Qaeda is a huge organisation, huge, terrible threat to us. Nobody actually mentioned that there was an 80-person strong unit of the CIA which had the same status as CIA country station. So something perhaps of the size of the Jordanian station of the CIA was entirely devoted to Osama bin Laden. It was called the Osama bin Laden unit. It was only 2 years later that we had got any corroboration of that from the 9/11 Commission report. So we got the Osama bin Laden unit. And then in the 9/11 Commission report, you see, some people said, oh, don't bother to read it, load of rubbish, it's just all made up by Philip Zelikow. Sort of true. However, if you follow the more cock-uppy sort of approach, which I personally do, and you think, well, they can't all be crooks at every level, everywhere in the US government. Maybe some honest people got onto the 9/11 Commission, maybe just by accident, and obviously not by design, but just at the medium level, perhaps. Or just people with grudges against other departments or whatever. So I had a really good look. I read every footnote. And it turns out now, the story has come out, that Zelikow, who wrote the report, basically, he's just a fantasist. His expertise is in the construction of historical legend, I think, is how it's put. But Zelikow, was a very busy guy. He was a bit hyperactive. He was busy making illegal phone calls to the White House, which he'd promised he wouldn't make, informing the White House of the progress of the investigation. He was their snitch, basically, and he was running the investigation. But he was very busy in the last few days. And into the footnotes, the dissident people on the 9/11 Commission actually managed to insert information into the footnotes, which was devastatingly damaging to the CIA. And they in particular, there was one person who flat out lied about legal advice that they'd had, which said that they couldn't pass on some information to the FBI. It was a flat out lie. The legal advice was pretty much the opposite of what she'd been given. And just to show that she wasn't stupid, this helpful little person in the 9/11 Commission mentioned in a footnote that when she copied on this advice to everybody saying you can't pass on the information to the FBI, the only person she failed to copy it to was the person she was claiming was the source of the advice. Now, how many coincidences are we expected to believe in? Obviously, this was the point at which, in a possibly illegal and certainly very wrong way, the FBI, and there's actually millions of cases of that. And but we didn't know any more of them until relatively recently, when there's been a flood of releases of official documentation. What we now know from the Inspector General's reports, because America does have a system which is supposed to work. It's not entirely hopeless. It doesn't work because of presidential fear just undermines everything else, and the war necessity argument undermines everything else. But actually, they do have these Inspector General's offices in these places like the CIA and the Pentagon. And, they do go through some sort of motions of making investigations, and half of it gets redacted, and half of them are engaged in the cover-up. But little bits and pieces come out. It's very difficult to stop little things coming out. There's that old Victorian saying, tangled webs we weave when we practice to deceive. And it's absolutely true. It's very difficult to tell lies in a consistent way when there's any scrutiny at all going on. So basically, what we now know, due to a guy called Kevin Fenton, who's done an absolutely heroic job of reading through all these things, is that there was an utterly undeniable, very consistent, organised decision in the CIA to protect the 9/11 hijackers. And the closer it got to 9/11, the more adamant Osama bin Laden, funnily enough, became at telling the hijackers to go ahead. And of course, some people think that Osama bin Laden is the most successful CIA agent of all time, and not just fantasists. The people in Pakistan will tell you that. I know a guy who told me that just recently, who apparently knew the family. But anyway, the nearer it got to September the 11th, the more desperate everybody became to get ahead with the hijacks before these guys all got rolled up, because it was a really close thing. The FBI was so angry, they're having shouting matches, they're finding out. The CIA was entirely sussed on Al-Qaeda, if it even was independent from the CIA. They had their main communications hub bugged by them and the National Security Agency. They monitored the planning session for 9/11, which happened in Malaysia. They were reporting back to the White House. But But the people who should have known about this were always kept in the dark, the FBI. As 9/11 approached, the FBI got hotter and hotter onto the trail. There was screaming, shouting matches, threats of legal action. All shit was breaking loose in 2 weeks before 9/11. But they still wouldn't give the FBI the information they needed, which would have stopped the 9/11 attacks. And, you know, the rest is history. Kevin Fenton's told us the story. It's a very heavy book. You know, I don't particularly recommend it to people who aren't interested in paper trail sort of issues. Any lawyer should read that book. It's a masterpiece. And now what we've had is Richard Clarke, who was the head of... This is all the build-up to the amazing news, which of course the media aren't disseminating because it doesn't fit their pre-judge story. We've had Richard Clarke, who was the anti-terror coordinator in the White House. And we've got Ali Soufan, who was the lead FBI investigator. Ali Soufan says, 2 days after 9/11, the CIA gave me the dossier I've been asking for months and months and months, and I went off and retched. This goes beyond incompetence. That's what he said. It's all on the record. Der Spiegel, you know, it's not even on dodgy internet, it's allegedly dodgy internet. So it's right on the record, undeniable. If you know anybody who works at The Guardian or on BBC, undeniable. And not only has Ali Soufan said that from the FBI end, but Richard Clarke, who was in charge of the CIA at the White House, I mean, that was where the only legal way that the CIA was supposed to be communicating with the White House, their masters, was through Richard Clarke. Richard Clarke has also said, they never told me anything. He said, they told me every bloody little detail. They told me that there was a big attack coming. They never told me any of the absolutely vital information, that they knew exactly what the alleged hijackers were up to, or at least some of them were up to. So, you know, the CIA has now got a hell of a lot to answer for. First of all, they blamed it for 5 years on the FBI's alleged incompetence. Bullshit. Then they get their friendly internet sites, I'm afraid I disagree with Tony Hall about this, to say it was Israel who did it as another distraction. Then they get the corporate media to say it was Saudi Arabia who did it. The place to start, in my opinion, I'm speaking as a researcher here, not as, you know, Reinvestigate 9/11, because we don't really have a fixed opinion in Reinvestigate 9/11. As a researcher, I'm saying, the place to start is the CIA. The paper trail's there. All we now have to do is to get, maybe if there are any journalists of integrity left in the heavyweight parts of the newspapers, they've got the story. The story is there. You know, it really is there. And we can now say that there was an agreement in the CIA to allow the 9/11 attacks to go ahead. They might not have intended them to happen in the way they did, but there was an agreement made in the CIA. There was a conspiracy, there was an agreement in the CIA, and that is now, we were right, and the sneerers and, you know, people who call us conspiracy theorists were wrong. There was a conspiracy in the CIA.